All right, here we are. We are recording the first episode of A Lesson Before Writing, which is a really clever title for this video podcast, and whoever came up with that deserves some kudos. This guy. So our plan here is just have an informal discussion about writing and publishing and editing and maybe teaching writing with a very loosey-goosey format. So we'll try to keep it to about 45 minutes or so. I'm Ted Morrissey. I'm a writer, teacher, and publisher. And among the fine artists and authors I've published are these two guys. One is Grant Tracey. I know, Grant, if you want to wave, thumbs up there. And this is Grant's most recent book that we've published, 5 Hard Bites, although Grant has just sent me a brand new manuscript, which I'm sure we'll talk about. And then Brady Harrison, whose book I discovered I didn't have any copies of because I sent all of them to you in Ireland, which is a whole nother story. So I had to go to the local library and check out a copy of Brady's book, The Term Between. So, but Brady also, of course, is working on something new. So that is probably as much introduction as we need to give, unless you guys feel like we need some more.
Well, what about you, Ted? Do you talk about you? What is, some projects, your own projects? Shameless shilling here on my part. So
absolutely. Well, I've moved to the center of my house, even though there's quite a bit of traffic here potentially, because I have my bookcase behind me, which I have strategically placed some of my books. Earlier this year, I published a collection of stories and sonnets, which I had all these short stories that were floating around in various publications for the past 30 years or so, and most of those publications have gone belly up, which is the way of a lot of literary journals. And I had tried to publish a collection of stories in 2012 with a publisher I was working with at the time, but that fell through. So I had some time on my hands this past year. So I thought, you know what, I'll put together a collection of stories, and I had some sonnets that I'd been writing. And so Delta of Cassiopeia is the name of that collection, and it came out, I don't know, in the spring sometime, and it's done okay in terms of reviews. Not too many people are buying it or reading it, but I just really wanted to give those stories, and particularly the sonnets, a kind of a second life, and have them out there in the world that maybe someday someone might find them, and so on. You've published, Grant, a few collections of short stories. We published one of them, Final Stanzas, but I know you're thinking about doing some kind of collection of detective fiction. Where does that project stand?
I don't want to take up a lot of time talking about Marvelous Me, but I've got I've done a whole bunch of these cab driving stories based on my experiences driving cab for a year before I went to get a PhD, and of course embellished with detective flavoring. So those are the Eddie Sands stories. And I got about 7 of those. And then there was a call for stories set in Seattle. So I was like, oh, Seattle, cool place. And so I took a couple of those Eddie Sands stories and reworked them with Seattle settings, and it changed the stories dramatically. It's hard to explain, but somehow once the setting changed, the stories changed from upstate New York to Seattle, and or the Puget Sound, I guess. And I call them the Mike Carmody stories because it's a different character. He's a different cab driver. He's a little more gentle than Eddie. And so I've worked up a couple of those. And then I've got sort of standalone crime stories, just, one-offs with various characters. So yeah, I've been writing a ton. For me, I try to clear everything up in the summer. So I just have my writing time, and I don't work on North American Review over the summer.
And Brady, I'm going to ask you about your collection, et cetera. But your thing about setting reminded me of the fact that I had this idea for a story or a novel or something for years, and I tried to write it multiple times, and I'd get a few thousand words into it, and it just, I don't know, it just wasn't working, wasn't going anywhere, and so I'd set it aside. Well, I don't even know what year it was. It was maybe 5 or 6 years ago, but my wife said, "Hey, here's a short story contest, and the only stipulation is the story has to be set in Chicago." And so I thought, oh, okay. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll try writing that thing I've been trying to write for years and just set it in Chicago, which had never been a thing before. And so I did. And for some reason, that just sort of unlocked, my whole approach to the story. And it ended up being kind of a short novel that it took me 4 years. The deadline for the story contest was like a month away, and it ended up taking me 4 years to write the novel. That's beside the point. But for some reason, giving it and I don't know that I'd even had a setting in mind before, but putting it in a specific setting and actually, setting it in specific hotels and bars and with street names and blah, blah, blah. For some reason, it unlocked my ability to write the story. I don't quite understand what happened there, but
Yeah.
Well,
so
not
ahead,
to bring James Joyce into the conversation, but that specificity of place is something that he thought was so essential. Like he wouldn't change a street name. He had to talk about the actual pub and places that people knew. It had to be grounded in the real world. I don't know how that affects our minds when we're starting to create or think about writing a short story, but it's fascinating to hear both of you say that place somehow brought into focus and brought about changes. I mean, for Grant to go from New York to Puget Sound, all the way across the country into a total other environment, whole other ecosystem, a whole other kind of world. Yeah, I'll look forward to reading those stories.
Yeah, it was fun. And what's interesting is, I'm a big Ed McBain fan, as you guys know, and he has his 87th Precinct stories that are kind of set in New York, but they're actually in a place called Isola, which is Italian for island. So it's like Manhattan, but it allows him, unlike, well, maybe it is like Triggering Town in Richard Hugo, but it allows him to create whatever he wants within the realm of New York, but he doesn't have to be, unlike James Joyce, the specific pub, right? And so that's kind of what I did with Winsome, which is this imaginary place in upstate New York that Eddie Sands lives in, which is modeled a lot on Peterborough, Ontario, where I got my undergrad at Trent and I lived for a long time. And a little bit of Seneca Falls, New York, which I've traveled to and seen, and Watertown, which we used to go to a lot as a kid. So it's kind of a made up place. But then when I went to Puget Sound, it was actually real places. And the Crest Motel, which was a seedy place in the 70s, and Northgate, a little bit tougher community, and suddenly in the ferry, in Bremerton and all that, and suddenly things start clicking. I don't know, it was weird. So I totally get what you're saying, Brady, in terms of something about being grounded in a real place made me make different choices. I can't explain it. It was kind of magical, and I can't wait. My wife and I are like, we're going. It's going to be a trip real soon, because I got to take in all the things I wrote about, because I haven't been there, and it's like that was the call. It's exactly what you're saying, Ted. Has to be set there. So I'm like, okay. So I start looking stuff up, and I'm getting fascinated by the whole area and the cafes and just all of it. And then a thing that triggered was I set the story in 74, but the guy's a former baseball player. So what better choice than the Seattle Pilots, which only lasted 1 year, played at a place, played at Six Stadium, which from what I've read was rather sick. Like around the 6th inning, the water pressure dropped, and all the ball players had to go home and shower at home. They couldn't, shower at the ballpark. So I'm like, I love this. What this is my kind of detail, So
that kind of telling, great detail. Now, so I want to intrude, and I have to say, and have to go on the record here, that Ted has forbidden Grant and I, in no uncertain terms, we cannot speak about hockey. So we have a lot of hockey detail we'd like to share, but that's going to have to wait.
Well,
I think you just the maple leaf clock in Grant's question. I think it's going to have to be your subliminal insertion of hockey into every conversation.
Yeah,
It hovers.
I know when we get to the new work we're working on, I don't know how I can't talk about hockey, but
Right.
I'll keep it limited, I promise.
So Brady, you've been in Ireland for a year, which I'm jealous of, teaching over there, but you're about to come back to the States. But you've got a work which you described as kind of along the lines of Howl. Tell us more. What's going on with that?
Well, okay, so this has been a very fraught experience. I wanted to write a novella because, as Ted knows and Grant knows too, it's a form that we all love and are always happy to work in. And so I was working on this kind of dystopian novella, a treatment of an exploration of our current cultural moment. But it was I've never had this experience before. The piece was so upsetting to me to write that I've actually set it aside. It bothered me so much to kind of imagine this dystopian world, a world on fire where, if you live in the West, but now if you live in the East or in the Midwest, the air is full of ash. And the divisions in the country, the extreme polarization. And so for the first time in my life, I think I set aside, and I don't know if I'll go back to it. I mean, Ted and I had talked about it, but I don't know if I'll go back to it because it was physically upsetting me. It was bothering me so much to inhabit, to look in, I don't know if it's looking, speculating on the short-term future and how things could go. And so I've set it aside and in a kind of liberatory way, switched over not to the long project that I want to pursue next and that I've mapped out, but for my last couple of months in Ireland, I've been working on ghost stories. So I've been writing short stories. And one of the things, and so this maybe is going to change I'm not seeking to change the direction of the conversation, but I think at some point, one of the things I would be interested in talking about as we go forward with the podcast is what is the place of the short story with readers, with contemporary readers? Like, we all write short stories. We all read for journals. We're all on editorial boards and we love short stories. And yet, maybe there's not really as deep a readership for short fiction, and certainly not much of a readership in some ways for novellas, unless you're Joyce Carol Oates or Stephen King. And it seems that readers prefer novels. So I'm not sure, I don't mean that we have to get into that now, but since we have been talking about short stories and our own love of reading them, and just as much our own love of writing short stories.
I think that's a great focus. As you guys know, I just got back from, just a couple of weeks ago, from Singapore, where I was attending the 16th International Conference on the Short Story in English. There were very few folks from the U.S. there. It was almost all Asian and Australian writers and academics, and some European and the Irish writers that Brady and I have talked about a little bit before we started the recording button. But that obviously is something that I've really been thinking about, is the short story, because it definitely is a form that has fallen somewhat out of favor because of the fact that it isn't financially viable for most folks to write in the U.S. Now, there were writers there from Taiwan who are short story writers. That's what they do for a living, because there's a a cultural situation in Taiwan where people are paying good money for stories, and people can enter contests and make lots of money. And so there are writers who are supporting themselves just by writing short stories. And of course, that used to be the case here in the U.S. and in other places, until TV kind of took over cultural entertainment. But it's interesting too, because all three of us teach in creative writing programs, and as far as fiction goes, the main thing we're trying to get students to write most of the time is the short story. But yet, as far as a commercial market, there isn't really one anymore. Nevertheless, there are lots and lots of short stories being published. I mean, thousands and thousands of short stories being published every year. In fact, we're going to discuss one here in just a few minutes. But I've thought about that. I mean, I think one way of looking at it is the short story is sort of a stepping stone to writing the novella or the novel. And so that's one reason to justify teaching the form, even though there really isn't a commercial market for it any longer. Or maybe it's just the inertia of tradition. That's what we've always taught in creative writing programs, so we just keep teaching that. I don't know what, Grant, you obviously teach a lot of creative writing. I presume that the short story is the main focus of your fiction courses?
Well, it's interesting. I would say that last semester it was about 50-50. I had a lot of students putting up chapters from novels for workshop. The speculative fiction boom that kind of took over in 2008 is really, it's very present in my classes. And so a lot of students are writing spec fic or variation on fanfic, like updating Nancy Drew, stuff like that. And it's awesome. I got no complaints about it. But yeah, I would say half the stuff I saw last semester in my workshop was chapters from novels, and then other students were writing more of the short fiction. And for me, I've never, I'll take a step back. When I was an undergrad, the short story was taught, at least at Trent University, as like a stepping stone for these writers. Here's a short story that, blah, 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 blah. They're working out their ideas for their novel. So, they would look at a D.H. Lawrence story and then compare it to, some novel down the road. But for me, the short story is in and of itself just a beautiful form. I don't really think of it as a warm-up for, novel writing. It's in and of itself an art, and I'm not trying to get all on some pedestal here, but that's just how I feel about it. So I have a real passion for the form and don't really, I like to champion it in and of itself,
Right.
Like I get frustrated when people say, well, Alice Munro, she writes novels as short stories. And I'm like, no, she writes short stories that are long, but they're not novels. But she has a lot of tricks that she uses that makes her short stories appear to be novelesque, like the use of lists, the use of timelines, different alternating points of view. I mean, there's all kinds of strategies she employs to create a feel of a big canvas, but she's still I'd call her a long story writer, not someone who's a novelist writing short stories. That's just my own personal feeling about it.
Well, I think, sorry, Brady. I was going to say, traditionally, I think people have sort of, the short story and the novel are kindred because they're both made of prose. But I think in many ways, the short story has more kinship with a poem in terms of its structure, in terms of the literary techniques that one might be able to successfully employ and that kind of thing. So, so I like to think of that kinship more so than the short story being just sort of a shrunken version of a novel. But what were you going to say, Brady?
Oh, well, just that, like Grant, and I should clarify that I don't teach in creative writing. I'm often on committees for graduate students in creative writing and read their projects. But yeah, there's some of the writers I most admire are ones who write short stories because they want to write short stories. So Grant has mentioned Munro, Tomasz Dubose, another Canadian writer, comes to mind. I suspect that in both those cases, people agents and publishers would say to them, well, why don't you write a novel? But what they see is the elegant, in some ways, nearly perfectible form is the short story. So I want to agree with Grant that maybe one of the things that we can do just in our conversation is to affirm the value of the short story as an art form and as a literary form that's incredibly elastic, right? It can be science fiction, it can be speculative, it can be mystery, it can be something joyous. It can have the scope, as Grant has said, of Monroe. Can have the compression of some of the minimalist writers. Carver comes to mind. Let's be defenders of the short story form.
Well, maybe I'm a bit of a turncoat, but one of the things I've been experimenting with for the last decade or so, in my novel Crow Song for the Stricken, and then the last novel that I finished, which isn't published yet, which I'm titling the Strophes of Job, I deliberately set out to write chapters of the novel that were also standalone short stories, and not a novel in stories or conceptual novel, but honest to goodness, novel. But you could take each chapter and send it out as a standalone, piece or whatever, without tinkering with it. And it's actually pretty challenging because once I got 20,000 words into the project, I would find myself working on a chapter/story, and I would come up with some plot detail or some twist in the plot that worked beautifully for the short story, but it would contradict or start to weaken some structural integrity of the novel as a whole because it contradicted something that was happening in some other piece of the narrative. And so I would have to maybe find some other approach that to use in that individual chapter/story to keep the integrity of the whole structure kind of moving forward. And so it's a lot more challenging than what it might sound to be to try to create that. But I really enjoy the process, and I ended up getting all of the pieces published independently before the novel came. In fact, I had to wait on Crow Song. I waited 2 full years to publish the novel because I had 2 stories that had been accepted, one by Southern Humanities Review and the other by Everest, that were not going to come out for another couple of years. And so I had to wait for them to come out in those forms before I could, publish the novel because of that whole business of first rights and all that stuff. But particularly with Southern Humanities Review, I was more than happy to wait a couple of years to have something appear there. But, again, it does complicate things. And so anyway, that was something that I've been kind of toying with. And like I said, the book I finished about a year ago, I did the same kind of thing and ran into the same sort of obstacles, but in the long run found it just as sort of artistically satisfying to do that.
Yeah, I'll just make a quick commercial. One of the books I have most enjoyed and most admired in recent years is a very interesting structurally, and I don't know if it's a novel or if it's a collection of short stories, but Olive Kittredge, a terrific book of stories that somehow has the scope and range of a novel. So those forms exist too, like
right.
Crow Song.
Right. Well, and not to get too far afield here, but the obviously novel is a pretty plastic term, and what it means and what it can be applied to, is pretty expansive. I talk to my students, for example, about Tolstoy's War and Peace. We call it a novel, but really it's got novel characteristics, but it's also historical. It's also philosophical. Tolstoy's kind of sorting out his own views about Christianity and about how serfs should be treated and blah blah blah. So anyway, there's a lot of stuff going on in those 1,200 pages besides what one would think of as sort of traditional narrative that you would find in a novel or whatever. So and as you know, I'm part of a weekly Finnegan's Wake reading group, And I mean, I've literally seen friendships break up over arguing about whether Finnegan's Wake is a novel or not. I mean, I sort of joke, but not really. I mean, I literally know two guys who came practically to blows and will no longer speak to each other because one is adamant that it's a novel and one is adamant that it is not a novel.
Wow.
Well, so let's go on the record too. So let's not let any of the things that we say in our sessions be the end of our friendships. We should establish that pretty early on. I think we're safe, but
I think so too. So yeah, I was going to do kind of a little teaser at the beginning of our recording, and I forgot. So I'll have to work on doing that later on in the next episode. But one of the things that the three of us talked about doing was, there's so much great writing that's being done and being published, but it's being published in literary journals and places where, unfortunately, not a lot of readers have access to it or even know to seek access to it. And so we thought each of our episodes we'd find a story perhaps in a literary journal that is worth talking about. And I get lots of literary journals, and this is the let me see, this is the recent, spring summer 2023 issue of Nimrod International Journal, which of course is a venerable and well-respected literary journal. And the theme of this, as you can see, is body language. And so I picked out a story and sent copies to Grant and Brady to read of a story called Runaway Nation by Laura Schmitt. And it was Nimrod's winner of the Francine Ringold Awards for New Writers. So let's give Laura some props here. And just what I do when I get a literary journal, I kind of start thumbing through it and looking for stuff I find interesting. And then once I get a paragraph or two into it, I'll go back to the contributors' notes and see who the writer is. I don't know why I do that. It shouldn't matter. But here's Laura Schmitt's contributors' note. She received her MFA in creative writing from Hollins University in 2022. She is the winner of the 2021 Mendocino Coast Writers Conference Short Fiction Contest and the 2021 Andrew James Purdy Prize for Short Fiction. Her work has appeared or is forthcoming in Grist, The Boiler, and Electric Literature. She lives in Nashville, Tennessee, where she works as an indie bookseller and editorial intern at Tin House. And again, we are discussing here for a few minutes her story, Runaway Nation. I guess the spoilers abound, so apologies to anyone who is hoping to read this for kicks and grins. But I do think it's worth tracking down even after all of our spoilers, because it's just beautifully written. And like Grant was saying earlier, I think it's a joy to experience, even if you kind of know what's going on in the story. But just very briefly, it's about a set of sisters, the four Brenner Davis sisters. In fact, let me just read the first couple sentences because that kind of sets up the basic premise. It says, from birth, we were called restless, the four Brenner Davis sisters, all delivered by the same obstetrician, 1 year between each of us and the next. Rebecca, Petra, Layla, Emma. Our mother, Amelia, was adamant on close pregnancies and names that ended in A. And so then we have this story which has a very interesting point of view. It's written in we, first person plural, which is unusual. And it's about this, it's set in the summertime, I think in Green Bay, Wisconsin. And there's been a serial type murder that's happened. And so suddenly all the girls in town are under this curfew because their parents are afraid of what might happen to them if they're out after dark. Meanwhile, boys in town don't have to abide by the same curfew. And that is sort of the basic plot that begins to unfold in the short story. So I don't know, what were some of your reactions? I know, Grant, briefly you kind of emailed me some of your reactions. So what did you have to say about the story?
Well, I really like it's something I've noticed with difference between YA and non-YA writing about youth is that usually in the YA world, it's in first person, and you're in the shoes of the character as they're living the events. But in the world of literary magazines, there's this sort of bigger perspective of an older, entity self looking back at what's going on. And I appreciated those moments where suddenly we'd be pulled out of the present time narrative into this sort of larger. So I don't want to give away spoilers, but there's this incredible sort of flash forward near the end where you hear about some of the fates of the girls, and it's just it just got me when yeah, because it's just so different for women compared to men. And I don't want to get too personal because there's been things revealed to me from close members of my family I had no idea had happened, things from attempted sexual assaults, sexual harassment in the workplace, rape, things of that sort of people that were close to me that I had no idea about it. But it's just a sort of thing that women have to navigate a lot more than men do. So even though I'm on the side of the girls in this narrative about why do the boys get to hang out late and let's go off on an adventure, and I get where they're coming from, there's also unfortunately this other reality in our society, and just the way she brings that home near the end just really upset me in a positive way, just in terms of just awareness about all of this. So I found that really moving. Mm-hmm. Especially as a dad who's got 3 daughters, and it's just you think about these kinds of things, and I don't like to be an overprotective parent, but I do worry about some of this kind of stuff in our culture,
Mm-hmm.
So
Brady, what are your thoughts?
Oh, well, Grant, fathers and daughters. This is a terrific story. It's very well written. One of the things that struck me most, and this is in part a reaction to being a reader for 12 Winter's Journal, is when you begin this story, you know immediately that you're in company with a really great writer who conjures a really rich world. This writer, like you know just from the first 2 sentences from where Ted began to read, that they know this world and that they're going to allow you to inhabit this incredibly rich diegesis, and that you're going to get to know, and just very few, like it's something of the magic of the short story. You're going to get to know these characters and their world and the things that they are confronting and struggling with, and the age that they're at. This was really powerful, and as Grant says, very, very moving writing. And so Ted, it's a great first choice. I think one of the things I think about a lot as both a writer and a reader is, what is the relationship between the author and the reader? What kind of relationship does the author seek to have? And this author invites us into this richly conjured world of these 4 sisters, and somehow we enter into this space, and we get to see what they're doing, why they're doing what they're doing, what they're experiencing, what pressures are existing around them. First rate short story, right? And so I look forward to seeing more of Laura Schmitt's writing, for sure.
Well, I think one of the really I agree with Grant that flash forward, which is like the next to last paragraph or 2 paragraphs from the very end of the story or something, is out of the blue, but not in a bad way. It just really drives home a kind of a poignant theme about the story. But this wee narrator, I don't think I'd have to reread the story again, but I don't think there's any point in the story where we get any sense that the narrator is one of these 4 girls. It's this sort of it's almost like magic realism in a sense, that the narrator is this sort of group consciousness of these four girls, which I think is fantastic. I could see, though, if this were workshopped in your typical fiction writing class, that this poor writer would be, bludgeoned for not having a clear narrative voice. And who is this girl? Which sister is she? And we need to know that. And I think so much advice that young writers are given in workshop settings is so wrong-headed and stifling that it can kind of drive me a little bit. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe if this story were workshopped in your typical kind of undergrad creative writing course, maybe they would be carrying Laura out on their shoulders by the end of the class period as having conquered the form or something. But I just feel like it's a risk-taking narrative posture which just works beautifully. But I think a lot of writers would be dissuaded from even trying it, because it kind of goes against so much sort of, typical fiction writing instruction. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I'd like to think I'm wrong about that.
Well, I've mentioned this before. The older writers, we called it head hopping in my day. They did it all, like Morley Callahan in All the Years of Her Life. He head hops to Mr. Carr's perspective. We're kind of with Alfred in the story, and then we suddenly have a Mr. Carr point of view, and to me it totally works. But in workshop in the 80s, when I was, it would be like POV ?
Right.
Like somehow that Henry James idea of limited third, central intelligence, or first person, those are your only options. And forget about second person point of view. At least when I was in workshop, that was kind of the unspoken rules, and so and I think after getting bludgeoned in workshop myself, you get to the point where you just got to trust yourself as an artist, and then find those voices. There's usually a couple of people that get you, and it's the same thing as sending out work. There's going to be an editor out there somewhere who gets you. You can have 20 that don't get you. How many agencies turned down J.K. Rowling? Just saying. They probably hide those documents now, but that's just. Yeah, I don't want to get going on workshops. I don't think workshops always work. I mean, I have heard about Flannery O'Connor. I had a professor at Kansas State, Paul McCarthy, who was in workshops with her when she was at Iowa, said she left the workshop frequently in tears because people just didn't get her, and they hated her stuff.
Right.
And she's a pretty good writer, so anyway, but yeah, I love what this writer's putting down. I think it's fantastic. And maybe it went well. I mean, I tried it as a professor teaching. I tried to create a nurturing environment where it's safe and people can say what they think, but also be supportive of the work. What is the work trying to do? Not what do I want the work to do? What is the work's trying to do, and how well is it doing what it sets out to do? At least that's the way I look at work that I'm workshopping, as opposed to hijacking the story. And anyway,
POV question mark?
Yeah, POV question mark. Exactly. Hemingway does it. I mean, so many writers, Fitzgerald. I mean, a lot of the old modernist writers, they head hop all the time. It's fine.
Well, Faulkner and A Rose for Emily, it's a little uncertain how many, there is a kind of we that tells that story, right? Whether it's one person speaking on behalf of the community. We saw what happened when Miss Emily locked up the house, and when they broke in to spread the lime, and but yeah, or is it a collective? So maybe there's a little. Maybe there are writers out there. Well, there's so much, so much we touched on today. One of the great things that I'm derailing the conversation again, but the relationship between the story and the novel and the richness of worlds. That's something I'll want to come back to as we go forward.
Yeah, and I love I was just gonna say I love the line early in the piece that sort of sets up that differentiation between boys and girls, and how girls are born close. There's a different bond than boys, born close, and it sort of sets up the whole gender thing that's going on, and but having their period together, like all that kind of stuff, like it just, it's different, and I appreciate her daring to go out there, because I could see somebody saying, well, wait a second, isn't that essentializing? So I thought that was a risk, just to say something as bold as that. And that's just coming back to what Brady was saying. That's part of the world that's created here. There's a certain authority with which this writer speaks that I believe in the world she's creating. And so I'm willing to go with her on a dare like that, like coming out and saying something like that, but that might trouble some people. Didn't trouble me at all. I totally believe it, So anyway.
Well, the other thing we could talk about this story for a long time, I think, but one of the things I loved too was it kind of plays with our national obsession with true crime. Yeah. And at one point in the story, I'm starting to wonder, is this going to be a story about figuring out who the serial killer is? And I think Laura gives us a couple of red herrings where we get a couple of characters introduced and a couple of scenes where it's like, oh, are we going to find out that this neighbor of theirs is the serial killer? But she never goes there. She keeps it, about the girls and about this issue of how our culture treats girls versus boys, especially in this kind of context. And so, but I think she's kind of playing with that trope of the true crime story, and that really what we ought to be paying attention to in those stories isn't the crime, but how it impacts maybe the victims and the people close to the victims and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and that's whole taking a step back, right? I mean, the year before we had more freedom than we have this year, and yet we're older. So like that's such a kid's perspective. I get that. I totally get what that. My bedtime used to be 9 o'clock. Now you're saying 8:30. Like I can just remember stuff like that. When
the story does so well with the perspective of youth, of childhood, and the pleasure of being on summer break. Yes. Like it, just like, I mean, I felt it palpably. Like, I wanted to be young again, ride my bike with my buddies, and get home when we get home, and
yeah, I don't want to get
and listen to the hockey game. Go ahead and say it, Brady.
Yes, but
no hockey games in the summer, Ted.
I don't want to get sentimental either, but I used to love Twin Pops. The Twin Pops, you could just break it in half. Your buddy a half, and you have a half. It was like, I don't even remember what they cost back in the 60s. I don't know if it was a dime. They were so cheap.
A dime or something, yeah.
Yeah.
And a root beer Twin Pop. Are you kidding me? Oh man.
Oh yeah.
Riding around on my banana seat bicycle.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, the 3 speeds.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So we're establishing a demographic for ourselves here right early on, aren't we?
Maybe we'll have to change the name of the podcast to 3 60-year-olds weeping.
Well, let's hold off on that change, Ted, for a bit.
So I think probably realistically we're going to have to bring this to a close time-wise, but this was a great conversation. I think anyway. I'm probably biased, but next time maybe we can get into some issues about theme and so forth that I wanted to kind of touch on here, not necessarily about this story in particular, because we'll do another story next month. But I don't know. Do you guys have any final closing thoughts you'd like to share before we sign off?
Oh, I would love to do what we originally thought about doing this time. I think it'd be really interesting about personas and author names, changing name, all that stuff. I think it'd be kind of cool, and what's behind that? What do we think about that? I mean, I think that'd be kind of fun to launch.
I agree. One of the things that Ted mentioned just in passing, which I think is, and it's such a commonplace little genre, but something that I hope we'll keep track of are author bios. What a weird little genre that we all look to and that we seek guidance for. Like, we don't even think about them. Some of them, I'll just say, make my teeth hurt, and some I think are great.
Yeah.
So I mean, besides reading great stories and any folks tuning in, read some short fiction. I want to say that. But yeah, I think going forward is I don't think us three old guys are going to run out of things to talk about.
No, not at all.
All right. Well, that'll be our teaser for our next episode. Maybe we'll begin by talking about personas and writer biographies and all of that kind of related stuff. All right. So I am going to hit the record stop button, and so we will see you down the digital trail.